In Paris, at the table where the treaty ending the 7 Years' War was being drawn up, France made one of the strangest decisions in its history. Two options lay on that table. On one side, Canada, with its forests, its rivers, its endless lands, very nearly a continent. On the other, a handful of small islands in the Caribbean. France gave up Canada and took back the islands it had lost in the war. Today, the decision looks like madness, but in Paris that day, no one was surprised. Voltaire had already dismissed Canada as a few acres of snow, because on those small islands grew one of the most precious substances of the 18th century world. Not oil, not gold. Sugar. The white crystals sitting in your kitchen today, sold for pennies a kilo, were once worth more than a continent. So how does the juice of a plant become that valuable? And who paid its true price? For the answer, we have to go back. Far, far back. The story began roughly 10,000 years ago in New Guinea. The people there discovered that when they chewed the stem of a tall, thick reed, a sweet liquid filled their mouths. And so sugarcane entered the small circle of humanity's first domesticated plants, where it remained, for thousands of years, nothing more than a crop to be chewed in the fields. Slowly, along the trade routes, the cane moved west toward India. And when the ancient world finally encountered it, it could not make sense of what it saw. According to an account passed down from antiquity, Nearchus, a general of Alexander the Great, returned from India in the 4th century BC, describing the miracle he had witnessed there. A reed that produced honey without bees. Honey without bees. Everything the ancient world knew about sweetness depended on the bee, and this plant broke the rule. But the cane had a weakness. Its juice spoiled quickly. It could not be carried far. It could not be stored. The invention that would turn it into a world power had not yet been made. That invention was made in India. In the first centuries of the Common Era, Indian producers learned to boil the cane juice down and solidify it, to turn it into crystals. On the surface, it was a modest kitchen technique. In reality, it was a revolution. Sweetness could now be stored without spoiling, packed into sacks, and carried to the other end of the world. In Sanskrit, these crystals were given a name meaning gravel, sharkara. The word passed into Arabic as sukar, and from there spread into the languages of Europe. And the word we use today, sugar, is the descendant of those ancient grains of gravel. It was the Arabs who carried the crystal out into the world. As Islamic rule expanded, sugarcane traveled with it, planted in Egypt, in North Africa, in Spain, and across the islands of the Mediterranean. There is a phrase historians like to repeat: sugar followed the Quran. And with the Crusades, Europeans came face to face with the sweet crystal for the first time. They wanted to take what they had seen back home with them. There was only one problem: the price. In medieval Europe, sugar was not a food. It was a medicine and a fortune. Apothecaries weighed it out and sold it gram by gram. Physicians prescribed it for everything from fevers to stomach ailments. It sat on the same shelves as the precious spices, and it was kept under the same locks. An ordinary person could live and die without ever tasting it. For the rich, meanwhile, sugar was the very language of display. At royal banquets, craftsmen sculpted castles, birds, and coats of arms out of sugar. These sculptures were placed on the table not to be eaten, but to announce the scale of a fortune. By some accounts, Queen Elizabeth I of England was so devoted to sugar that a German traveler who saw her in 1598 noted that her teeth had turned black. Rotten teeth, even in the most powerful woman in Europe, were a mark of wealth. Demand ran far ahead of supply, and the solution Europe would find for this problem was about to change the direction of world history. In 1493, as Christopher Columbus set out on his second voyage to the Americas, he loaded something new onto his ships: sugarcane cuttings. The cane took to the soil and the climate of the Caribbean so completely that within a few decades, the islands had begun turning into vast sugar fields. But producing sugar was among the most brutal work on Earth. The cane had to be cut under a scorching sun, crushed, and its juice boiled in cauldrons of infernal heat. And once harvested, the cane spoiled within hours if it was not processed. It was a relentless machine, a production line that ground human beings down. And Europe's plantation owners, to keep that machine turning, reached for the darkest solution in history. Over the following 3 centuries, roughly 12.5 million people were carried in chains from Africa to the Americas. By historians' estimates, the destination for the greater part of them was the sugar plantations, the small, lethal islands of the Caribbean, and the fields of Brazil, producing what the age called white gold. Life expectancy on the sugar islands was so short that the plantation economy could only survive on an unbroken flow of human beings from Africa. Every spoonful of sweetness stirred into Europe's teacups came from that machine on the far side of the ocean. And now, at last, we can return to that table in Paris. France's decision to write off Canada and take back islands like Guadeloupe was not madness in 1763. It was cold arithmetic. The sugar of those small islands poured wealth into the treasury, while the whole of Canada had for years done little but drain the French budget. The price of a continent had been paid in sugar. But the ones paying the true price were in the fields. And at a certain point, the consumers of Europe began to realize it. In the England of the 1790s, the opponents of slavery invented a weapon the world had never seen before: the boycott. Pamphlets told readers that the sugar in their teacups was, in truth, produced with blood. Hundreds of thousands of English families refused to buy Caribbean sugar. By some accounts, this was one of the first great consumer boycotts in history, and for the first time, it turned a spoonful of sugar on the table into a question of conscience. Slavery did not end overnight. It was dismantled, step by step, over decades of struggle across the 19th century. But the blow that truly shook sugar's throne came from an entirely different direction, from a wartime blockade. When Napoleon declared the continental blockade against Britain in 1806, the British Navy answered by strangling France's sea trade. The sugar ships from the Caribbean could no longer reach French ports, and an entire empire, all at once, found itself without sweetness. The solution came from a place no one took seriously: the soil. German scientists had shown in the 18th century that a common variety of beet contained sugar. The blockade transformed that piece of laboratory curiosity into a national cause. According to the story as it is told, when Napoleon was presented with the first loaves of beet sugar in 1812, he was so moved that he took the Légion d'honneur from his own chest and pinned it on the producer's coat. The consequences of that small ceremony were enormous. Sugar was no longer the monopoly of tropical islands, plantations, and ocean fleets. It could be produced in any field in Europe. White gold had begun its descent into the ordinary. Throughout the 19th century, as beet and cane production raced against each other, the price of sugar fell and fell and fell. The luxury that had once rotted the teeth of queens was now going into the tea glass of the factory worker. And this was a far more important transformation than it appears. Historians argue that what kept the exhausted workers of the Industrial Revolution on their feet was, to a great extent, sweetened tea. Cheap, fast, instant calories. By one calculation, sugar consumption per person in England rose roughly 20-fold in the space of 2 centuries. Sugar had been born as an ornament of aristocracy, had become the fuel of empires, and was now the daily bread of the working class. By the time the 20th century arrived, it was in everything: in bread, in canned goods, in drinks, in sauces. It had become invisible. And it was inside that very invisibility that the story's final dark act began. In the America of the 1960s, the scientific world was hunting for the culprit behind a steady rise in heart disease. There were 2 suspects on the table: fat and sugar. Documents that came to light in 2016 revealed what had happened behind the scenes of that debate. According to the researchers' findings, the sugar industry's trade organization had secretly paid Harvard scientists in the 1960s to publish an influential review article. The article played down sugar's role in heart disease and pointed the finger at fat. For decades, the public heard only half of the real argument. Today, the world produces hundreds of millions of tons of sugar every year. Obesity and diabetes are counted among the great health crises of our age, and a growing number of countries now place a tax on a substance that was once counted as royal treasure. The wheel of value had turned full circle. Now look once more at that sugar bowl in your kitchen. For the crystals inside it, people crossed oceans, empires bargained over islands, millions of human beings were put in chains, and a continent was traded away on paper for a handful of islands. Then, those same crystals became so cheap that restaurants now give them away for free. But through the entire history of sugar, one rule has never changed. Whatever the price tag says, someone has always paid the true cost. First the people who chewed it, then the people forced to grow it, and now the people who consume it every day, often without ever noticing. The next time you drop a spoonful into your tea, you might ask yourself, in this 10,000-year story, whose turn has it become? And who is paying the price this time?